good. So today we're here to talk, though, about the birth of and the outworkings of the Reformed Baptist, the modern Reformed Baptist movement in America, which the two of you have had experience with, and you can speak to with some level of knowledge. And so we wanted to talk about that. And one of the dates that you gave me was, remind me again, June 7th, 1966. And
yeah, if we had to pick a date, a hard date for the beginning of the modern Reformed Baptist movement, I believe for anybody who studies the actual history of it, it would have to be June 7th, 1966, and the place where the modern Reformed Baptist movement got started, really got off the ground, was Carlisle, Pennsylvania. In fact, I facetiously, but only half facetiously, tell young Reformed Baptist men that at least once in their life they have to make Hajj to Carlisle. And because there in Carlisle you would have Grace Baptist Church, where it all began. You would have the headquarters of ARBCA, and you would also have the U.S. headquarters of Banner of Truth. And they're all there in Carlisle. But June 7th, 1966 was the first day of a ministers' conference that Walt Chantry put together and was held at the church. And so at the men, I have a photo of all the men that were there. I think there were 110 who showed up, and they were virtually anybody who was anybody in the Calvinist as a Calvinist and a Baptist at that time was there at that meeting. And it's interesting to see these men and to see them, a young Walt Chantry and others there, all in the group photo. So it was from that meeting that, and one of the purposes of the meeting was to start talking now more about cooperative efforts.
Oh, okay.
So there was a real felt need to start getting together and to cooperate in areas of need. So 2 years after that, I believe it was in 1968, the Reformed Baptist Association began. And that drew in churches from Pennsylvania up through New England, all the way to Maine, and from Virginia. And pastors would get together. But one of the things you have to remember at the time, these young men at that time, in 1966, 1968, they didn't have as full-orbed an understanding of the 1689 confession that we would have today. Through men like Dr. Jim Renahan and Dr. Mike Renahan, and others who are real experts in particular Baptist history. So these men held to a view that none of us would hold to today, certainly in our associations, that there could not be formal cooperative efforts through the association. Everything had to be managed through a local church. So, for instance, the pastors' conference, which soon began, the church in Montville had oversight of that. In Montville, New Jersey, the family conference that soon began, that drew people in from all along the East Coast and beyond, and met at the shore at Harvey Cedars, New Jersey, that was under the oversight of Grace Baptist in Carlisle, because they had the idea that every ministry has to be under the direct control of a local church, and the association, as an association, didn't have authority to do anything. Now, that's not consistent with Reformed Baptist history. And today, I think Dr. Renahan has proven that beyond doubt for us that the phrase communion between the churches in the 1689 means formal communion. And of course, the men who brought who started the associations in England, they cooperated formally through in ministerial training and so on. So in the early days, then, the RBA was just, for the most part, a ministerial fraternal, a large one. But they did cooperate in sending and supporting missionaries. But it was Grace Baptist in Carlisle that was the main church when it came to missions. So people would send their money to Grace Baptist Church to support missionaries. And Walt Chantry, Pastor Chantry, started to realize this is not the way it should be done. So in the early 1980s, there was discussion in the RBA about the formation of a spin-off organization known as Reformed Baptist Mission Services. And interestingly and ironically, it was Al Martin who came up with that name. The records prove that. I have them. It's very interesting. He's the one who suggested the name Reformed Baptist Mission Services. But then their church and others that orbited closely around them soon pulled away from RBMS because they didn't believe in active associations with authority. It was still very much a local church mindset and everything under the control of the local church. So from the original RBMA, you had the spin-off of RBMS, which began formally in 1984. And then through RBMS, you had the spin-off later on of the National Association of Churches, the Association of Reformed Baptist Churches of America. So everything in the modern movement is traced back to the very beginning of June 7th, 1966, Carlisle, Pennsylvania.
That's interesting. So let's take that kind of piece by piece, if you don't mind, and let's start with just the initial meeting. And what were some of the, if you don't know this right off the top of your head, then you don't have to answer. But what were some of the needs that maybe these pastors saw that weren't being met, or to put it another way, what were some of the areas in which the Baptists in America as a whole, some of the areas that were the things that were lacking in those, that where they felt a need to come together as Reformed Baptist ministers and to have this meeting on June 7th, 1966?
Well, I actually have the original letter of invitation that went out to everybody.
And that'll be published eventually, maybe.
Yeah, it'll surface. And they of course were interested in missions, and they were interested in church planting, and they were interested in ministerial training. Now, you have to remember that many of these men came out of denominations where they had been hurt in some way or another by a heavy-handed hierarchy. And so, like it is when you let's say you get sunburned, to use an illustration. If you go to the beach and you get sunburned and you get into the shower the next morning, you can't stand the normal amount of heat that you used to the day before. And I believe that some of these men overreacted towards things they had experienced in their denominations to the point where they now said, we're not going to have any hierarchy, and we're not going to have any association with authority to do anything other than what the local church will oversee and supervise.
Now, would you say that the hurt that you're referring to that many of these men had experienced was primarily rooted in a doctrinal issue?
Sure. They had become Calvinists, and they had experienced difficulties in their background.
Okay. And it wasn't because these men had different ideas necessarily about methodology. all the time, but mainly it had to do with their soteriology, and which would work out into their ecclesiology, if I understand.
Yeah, and I want to point this out, that none of the men at the time had as full-orbed an understanding of the 1689 as our young men would have today in studying Baptist symbolics. You know, our men today are head and shoulders above those guys in their understanding of the 1689 in particular Baptist history. But God was pleased to really bless those early years.
So that's kind of, through that association, that initial gathering of these men, that's kind of how things got rolling, so to speak.
Yes.
Though they weren't in their full mature form that we see today.
Right.
And so in regard to missions, because as you said, the first meeting had somewhat to do with missions, but then also the 2 years later with the formation of the missionary.
Well, no, the first meeting was in '66, and then 2 years later the RBA formed, the Reformed Baptist Association, and then as they started to discuss different needs, that's when there came to be more formal discussion about the need for a Reformed Baptist missions organization. And that eventuated in the formation of RBMS, Reformed Baptist Mission Services, in, I believe, Anderson, Indiana, in 1984.
Yeah. So we're talking about a 16-year.
Yeah. So, you had, for instance, Grace Baptist in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, having the oversight of the family conference. You had the church in Montville, where Al Martin was, having oversight of their pastors' conference, and also ministerial training, because they started the Trinity Ministerial Academy. And so many churches cooperated, and even Walt Chantry in the early years, used to go over and lecture at TMA, as well as Leon Blosser. I believe Leon Blosser taught apologetics or something like that early on over there.
He eventually was a missionary in the Middle East.
So, and here were churches that were really just 3 hours apart. And I can remember these early RBA meetings that would draw men from as far away as Maine in the north and Virginia in the south. And the big meeting that eventuated in discussions about the formation of RBMS, that had near 200 men present.
Oh my goodness.
So some of these meetings were very large. And the family conference, that was held at Harvey Cedars, New Jersey, that used to draw lots of people to the family conference. They were blessed times. I remember being there when I was married in '74, and I think it was in 1975. My wife and I attended one of those meetings. The first time I got to hear Stuart Alliott from Britain and so on.
So, what became of the missionary organization that originally sprang up as a result of those discussions? Is that still in existence in some form today? Or?
Yes, it's been absorbed into ARBCA. It's been absorbed into the Association of Reformed Baptist Churches of America, because there was, as we grew in our understanding of what needed to be done. In more than missions, what needed to be done in publications, what needed to be done in ministerial training, what needed to be done in home missions, we recognized that RBMS couldn't fulfill that role. So,
and I think one of the things that may be helpful to think about is that RBMS was not a typical mission society. It was not simply an organization overseen by one church. It was a joint effort of many churches, but it was not just a typical mission society where a mission society entirely ran this missions effort and simply brought people in from churches. The churches were still quite active in the process of sending a man from one of their churches out on the mission field. RBMS was more, if I understand properly, correct me if I missed something here, they're much more practical. Let's get a central place, a central office, where we've got a secretary to help handle a lot of this stuff. That you've got churches where you've got a sole pastor, maybe an elder serving with him, that's small, they don't have a lot of time, but they could all work together, get this central office set up with a secretary, and eventually, I don't know at what point they had a coordinator.
We had a coordinator early on, and you know,
Yeah.
I mean, our organizations even now are not top heavy. I mean,
Right,
how many employees does ARBCA have?
Two.
We have Dr.
Three.
Renahan, three employees.
Yeah.
And so RBMS had David Straub
Yeah.
as a coordinator. I believe Leon Blosser was the first coordinator of RBMS.
Okay, yeah. But you needed someone who could pick up the intricacies of currency exchange, that would learn something about the laws, and of course they had connections with mission societies that they would talk to and get an education from, get help with. But what was I guess characteristic of RBMS was it kept the accountability for the missionary with that local church. And while there was some accountability on the RBMS level, because they developed qualification standards and for the men that were sent out, he didn't get removed from the church, and he didn't have 30 and 40 and 50 churches supporting him usually. That church really took on the responsibility for helping raise his support, but they had a network that they had some confidence in. We're going to all have the same doctrinal viewpoint. It was really a unity issue. We've got the same doctrine. We know that this man that's going out on the field is going to preach the gospel we preach. And he's not going to involve himself in methodologies that are going to be contrary to the message we're preaching. So it was a very unique, I think, sort of organization, not top-heavy, that kept the local church very much involved, and you had fewer churches than involved in his support, so that when he came home, for example, on a furlough, he didn't spend his entire furlough just running all over the United States from church to church. He really had some genuine time of ministry in his home church.
Wouldn't have to do deputation.
Yeah. Another pastors raised the money.
Now, and RBMS is this way today. I mean, a missionary has to be sent from a local church and has to be under the oversight of a local church. It's always been that way in RBMS and even today. But now you had a central office that could collect funds from the member churches and other churches that were not members but still wanted to do something to help Reformed Baptist missions throughout the world. So we had an office in Carlisle. We had a coordinator, paid position. We had an administrative assistant. We owned a little bit of property in office equipment. But with some of the Reformed Baptist churches at that time, even that is something as simple as owning at that time a typewriter, was something that they believed that an association could not do. And so there began the cleavage between the two Reformed Baptist camps, if you that's a good way to put it. There began the cleavage between the two groups, headed largely by those churches that orbited around Carlisle and were members of RBMS, and the churches that orbited around Montville. And the issue of the beginnings of RBMS was really the first cleavage point in the modern movement. There were churches that pulled away because RBMS had gotten off the ground. We became members of RBMS at that time. A few years into RBMS's existence. So,
What year did you?
I don't recall when our church became a member of it, but David Straub was the coordinator at the time, and we had David come to the church, present the ministry of RBMS to the church. We then voted on membership, applied for membership, and I served on the administrative council in RBMS for several years.
Yes.
And
you were basically a young pastor.
Yeah.
Who had to look at this and make some decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And it really, and on some levels, you were being tested about your loyalty. But for you, it was a doctrinal issue that got you through that decision-making process.
Well, and it was also, I started studying particular Baptist history more and more, and I came to the conclusion that any notion of that formal associationalism wasn't confessional was just patently untrue from the confession and also from history.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, that's one thing that really kind of struck me whenever I first read the article the chapter on the church and the confession was how, for lack of a better word, how balanced it was between associationalism and also the autonomy of the local church. Baptists have a real kind of bone to pick, I guess you could say, whenever it comes to the issue of autonomy of the local church. That's one of our distinctives. It's what distinguishes us from being Presbyterian or Anglican or what have you. But even in those early years in the 1689, you see that is the case, that they don't completely discount associations. And even moving forward to the Philadelphia Association, they were very much in favor of associations in their documents.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you bring that up, because what really moved me as the years went by was a study of the first 100 years of the Philadelphia Association. Mm-hmm. And the minutes of the Philadelphia Association from 1707 to 1807. I made a very detailed study of how the Philadelphia Association operated. Mm. And that helped develop my own thinking with regard to associationalism and the legitimacy of associationalism and so on. It's also important to remember that from the beginning, RBMS was a full subscription organization. Mm. That is, members were required to fully subscribe to the 1689 Confession of Faith. From day one, that was the case. And as problems came up within the ranks of RBMS, the Confession of Faith always was used to deal with churches that were moving away from the Confession of Faith. And if a church moved away from the Confession of Faith, as has happened, they could not retain their membership in RBMS. And over the years, that happened on 4 or 5 occasions within RBMS. You would have pastors say adopt a new covenant view with regard to the law. And or you'd have a pastor, I can recall, there was a church in Oregon who moved away from a cessationist view to a non-cessationist view. And those views were not tolerated in RBMS. So RBMS and then later ARBCA, as developed, have always been full subscription to the 1689.
So you had mentioned, and correct me if the language I use here is incorrect, but when ARBCA came into existence, or over time maybe, that it kind of swallowed up RBMS, and it became just kind of part of this.
As we were developing, we were coming to understand that full-orbed associationalism required much more than cooperation in missions. You brought up chapter 26 of the Confession of Faith, and you know that chapter deals with conflicts in and between local churches. And we didn't have any way to do that, either in the RBA that was still in existence at the time, Reformed Baptist Association, or RBMS. Mm-hmm. There was no way to deal with problems that came up either within or between churches, the way paragraph 15 of chapter 26 talks about. Yeah. And so as we developed in our own understanding of what that required, mm-hmm. That's when the original RBA ceased to exist. It died because there were those of us that wanted to see accountability, such as the Confession of Faith teaches, and that was not well received by some of the churches, and that's a whole nother part of the history, but that's a part of the history that happened in the mid-'80s, and that's when it was, mid to late 80s, when that happened, when we ultimately decided that the RBA was no longer serving a useful function. It was just a ministerial fellowship. We had other opportunities for ministerial fellowship. We didn't need to continue that association. But the interesting thing is that out of the ashes of the old RBA grew ARBCA. Mm-hmm. Because the Constitution that we had written to try to make the old RBA a more active association, a constitution that was written by myself and by Pastor Greg Nichols, who at that time was in the Reformed Baptist Church in Grand Rapids, Michigan. That constitution that we wrote became the document that we began with at our constitutional convention down at Heritage Church in Georgia, when we had the constitutional convention to get ARBCA off the ground. So,
and that was 97, if I remember right. Is that what was it, 96 or 7?
97. But I think that's when it was. But you remember the invitations went out to meet at Heritage Church in Georgia,
Fayetteville,
to form an association, not to debate whether there was going to be an association, or to go back and debate whether it was going to be an active association or not. We had already decided we needed a more active association that's going to be able to do far more than merely cooperation and missions, but also had some teeth in it as to how to deal with difficulties and differences that could come up both within and between local churches.
Something a little bit more dynamic.
And so we wrote that Constitution. I served as chairman of the steering committee at that time that brought all of this together. And so now RBMS is a part of ARBCA. It's the missions part. Okay. The foreign missions part of ARBCA. So when we merged the two organizations, because ARBCA came first, and then a couple of years later, RBMS and ARBCA merged together.
It functioned independently for just a brief time.
Okay. So it seems like, based on the way that you've been talking, the RBMS has, since that merger, has continued to function the way that it's always functioned, with the missionaries being under the local church and that kind of thing. Yeah. So nothing's changed on that front.
No, nothing's changed on that front. We probably have more in home missions today going on than we did back then.
Oh, yes.
Because RBMS was not allowed to be involved in home missions, as I understand it.
They were strictly a foreign missions organization. Really, the Constitutional Convention, for lack of a better word, in 97 was when I that was my introduction in activity with really becoming involved with Reformed Baptists. And even though I had I was involved, just nothing. There was nothing official until then, and there were two of us here at the church that were very interested and expressed interest, and so we received the letter of invitation.
And again, Walt Chantry was a key figure because the whole discussion about the beginning of ARBCA began at a Banner of Truth conference at Messiah College in Grantham, Pennsylvania, when 5 guys got together to talk about the need for a national association.
Okay.
And I don't know who all 5 were. I believe it was Walt, Chantry, Steve Martin, I believe Ted Tripp.
Okay.
Was
Tom Lutz in that?
I think perhaps, but I'm not sure.
Okay.
But 5 men got together, and then it was decided there that an invitation would go out to call Reformed Baptist men together at Heritage Church to have a constitutional convention. And we met down there for several days and actually wrote a constitution. Mm-hmm. But and again, the seed document was the constitution that had come out of the old RBA, as we tried to make it more active, and also the constitution of the Southern California Association of Reformed Baptist Churches. Mm-hmm. So we had both of these documents to use, and we hammered out the constitution that ARBCA has today.
That's good.
The original goal, I think, was to make a formal 4-pronged effort. Would have been foreign missions, home missions, publication, and ministerial training. Mm-hmm. And those were the 4 things we really wanted to see an organization that could work with those 4 concepts or 4 endeavors and get something done. Mm-hmm. And our church here was part of RBMS. That's how I got into it. So, but I was already convinced.
And the interesting thing is the very first year of our associational life is basically when we had the offer from Westminster Seminary in California to start the Institute of Reformed Baptist Studies. That happened right away.
Yeah.
You know, through Dr. Godfrey in California, he and Earl Blackburn, I believe the story goes, they had met for lunch, and Dr. Godfrey asked Earl what's going on in Reformed Baptists today, among Reformed Baptists, and Earl said that we're thinking of having developing a seminary of our own through our associational life. And he basically came back and said, well, why don't you put a professor on our campus and we'll cooperate together. So that was the first big thing that came before ARBCA a year after, well, probably the same year that we started. We got the idea because the idea was floated by Dr. Godfrey.
Yes.
And then the Institute of Reformed Baptist Studies began at Westminster.
Yeah. And wasn't that was 98, wasn't it?
Yeah.
98 or 99. It was real quick. RBMS was up and going. Mm-hmm. So here's your first endeavor. It's in place. The next one was ministerial training with the Institute of Reformed Baptist Studies. And while those 2 are going on, we're starting to work on publishing and church planning. Those took a little bit longer to get steam up because we're a small organization. Mm-hmm. You've only got so many people that can do so many things. And it was very helpful once RBMS was subsumed, I don't know if that's the right word, into ARBCA, because then you no longer had 2 functioning administrative councils, and you had one administrative council and then and basically a committee set up for RBMS. So that helped a lot of things come together. So.
And in regard to state associations, at what point did you start to see that really kind of blossom, and maybe some existing associations saying, we want to be ARBCA, or just, associations that never existed started to come into being, or what have you? How did that seem to work?
Well, I guess the earliest state association, once RBA went belly up, was the Southern California Association.
I think so. That had a constitution and an organization that was ready to move.
And that is a dynamic organization that continues to this day. We, of course, have the Texas Area Association of Reformed Baptist Churches, TARBC. There's the Georgia Association. of confessional Baptists. So
you use the word, when did that bloom? If you've got one state association that starts in roughly 92, I would guess, 92, 93, and there's where the Southern California Association started. We don't, Texas Area Association, I think, is really the next state association. We started 3 years ago. So the bloom, if there's a bloom, is now.
Yeah.
Because almost at the same time the Georgia Association constitutes, and right now there's discussions about one. Well, I don't know how much I should say. There's discussions elsewhere going on with consideration of other state or area associations. Now, none of these are organically connected to ARBCA.
Yeah.
And all of them have churches within their state associations that are not members of ARBCA. So we're trying to maintain, I think, a proper autonomy, and yet there's a lot of cross-pollination and encouragement and some accountability.
Carrying over that imagery of the blossoming
Okay.
that.
it's really interesting to see the development of state associations, and I think it's safe to say that every one is a full subscription association.
Yes. That we know of.
Yes, and all have the built-in accountability to be able to deal with problems that come up within the association, like our confession calls us to do.
Yeah. And you mentioned full subscription a couple of times. For those listening or watching that aren't as familiar with Reformed Baptist language, can you maybe explain what is meant briefly by the term full subscription in regard to ARBCA and RBA?
You might do a better job than I would, but I would think, at least in part, you can help by contrast. We don't mean absolute subscription. We don't mean a word-by-word subscription. We're not looking at a document that we believe to be inerrant or inspired as we believe the Scriptures are. We see it as a subservient, I think that may be a good word, authority. And I know that's not a real, that's not something Americans like a lot, but we have a lot of subservient authorities to the Scriptures that we recognize, that we want to be faithful to. And for a local church, there's none better than the solid pastoral ministry and a solid confession to which that church fully subscribes and requires their officers to give their oath to holding and preserving and
full subscription means every doctrine taught in the Second London Confession of Faith has to be fully subscribed to by members. We were challenged early on in the first year of ARBCA's existence that there were some who said that's going too far, full subscription. And so they wanted substantial subscription, or they wanted system subscription. And these were other technical names that were thrown about, and we've rejected it every time. And so you have, the opportunity, if you don't like ARBCA and you think we're too tight, you can join FIRE, Fellowship of Independent Reformed Evangelicals, I guess it stands for, which historically was kind of a spin-off of ARBCA.
It seems so. I don't know all the details.
With men forming that didn't like our subscription policy.
Different purpose.
Different purpose.
Though we have friends in FIRE. I mean, I have some good friends in FIRE, but man, I am so sold on the essential nature of full subscription to the confession that I don't see it. I'm not going to go that direction. But
well, just to kind of conclude, we're getting the signal here, but just to kind of conclude, maybe some areas that you're at liberty to speak of, the things of excitement that you see maybe on the horizon for ARBCA, and we've already discussed the history and what's currently going on in ARBCA, but maybe some things that you might be at liberty to discuss that you see that are of interest, or maybe even some things that you see that maybe excite you. about what's
the main
on the
thing that
horizon?
excites me, knowing that we'll be in our graves in a few years here, is the number of such well-prepared young men that are graduating from RBS and taking pastorates in our churches. That's, to me, the most exciting thing. Larry's son, Matthew, is currently at IRBS right now, and these are men that are just head and shoulders above what we were at their age.
Oh my, yes.
And we believe they're getting the finest education in the world today.
Yeah.
Under IRBS and in cooperation with Westminster. And it's just exciting to see these guys coming out and graduating and moving around the country and becoming pastors in ARBCA churches, and also being involved in church plants. So it's exciting to see these guys graduating, and that's the most exciting to me, I think.
Yeah, when you continue to see young men get a hold of the confession, read it, and without over romanticizing this, falling in love with this document, seeing its merit, seeing its depth, seeing its usefulness in a local church, that continues to be the thing. I mean, we were guys from far afield from anything we would think of today as Reformed Baptists, and God, in His providence, brings us into that. And to continue to see that happen, and we still get contacted by men. Hey, I'm alone in my study. I'm working through some texts, and I'm starting to believe some things. Does anybody else believe these things? And that's still that happens is still very encouraging, and we think that's the thing of the Spirit of God. The churches that we have here in this area now, I mean, we've got 6 churches that have declared themselves full subscriptionists, 1689 churches. That's super encouraging. I mean, when I came here 18 years ago, we were the only church. We felt very much alone. We had some fellowship with other Reformed, covenantal, and Calvinistic sort of folks that we were thankful for, but to see what God has done that no man can do is very encouraging to me now. And I think that's going on not just in Texas. I think it's going on all over. I think as the darkness increases in America, the light keeps shining brighter and brighter. And it makes people really study and pay attention to their doctrine. And so ARBCA, I think, stands there as a place and an organization to keep encouraging that. And it's a place that these kind of young men that come along and want to be taught, want to be held accountable for their positions, can come and be part of that. And we're small. We'll probably, I don't know, maybe we'll always be small. The other thing there's a couple other things, but another thing encouraging me about ARBCA is getting seeing how important church planting is in the United States of America. And I don't want to give too much weight to this the third thing I'll mention, because I do believe these issues are primarily issues of the Spirit of God that work off of what Paul taught in Ephesians 1 when he prayed that God would grant them illumination and understanding. This is what we continue to pray for, the Spirit's work in bringing people to understand and believe and submit to the truth. All right, that's the main thing. But this third thing I'm mentioning is there has been, in the last couple of years, the availability of resources that Reformed Baptists have really not had a lot of. And some people who are managing those resources who are serious about the confession and husband those resources for the support of those who also believe in the full subscription position to the confession. And those resources are starting to go to work.
Amen.
And we're very encouraged about that, very thankful for that. So we're seeing church planning, we're seeing scholarships, things. Yeah. There's mission support coming out of that. Very encouraging things. I don't know what God will do with that. That's His business. But
we've been able to do so much more cooperatively than any local church has the possibility of doing individually. And it's been a wonderful thing to see the blessing of God upon our cooperative efforts in all of these things. And, we'll soon be gone. We're considered older men now in our association. And we'll soon be gone. But I have great confidence in the young men that are coming up.
Yeah.
Well, speaking for
Amen.
the young confessing Baptists, we definitely appreciate all the efforts that you guys have put forth and the trials that you've had to go through and the legacy that you've left us. So hopefully the Lord makes us truly grateful for those things. So thanks for your time, guys.
Very welcome.
Yeah. All right.